Welcome to American Education FM, everybody. I'm Dr. Sean Brooks. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's safe to say that there's plenty going on. In fact, I would sort of summarize a great deal of what's happening almost like a heartbeat to an extent. There's sort of the ebb and flow, the back and forth, and just kind of a very consistent pump that seems to happen, certainly within the news cycle that I've always found to be rather interesting. There are sometimes particular moments or particular stories that will come about where it almost seems like everybody's talking about a very singular thing or a singular topic. And then the opposite pump happens where everybody basically goes back into their own corners. And of course, they start to dig up information on their own, and then they share all of that information. And then everybody gets brought back right to a middle and a singular subject again. I think this is one of those moments where everybody's kind of back into their own corners. Everybody's analyzing information from a number of different angles regarding 1,000 different things, all kinds of stories going on out there, certainly stories at the local level, state level, always the federal level, and then, of course, the worldwide level as well. So I want to kind of touch on a little bit of everything here, I think, in this, and I'm going to start here. I want to get into some audio, which I referenced in the last episode, and how I find the audio of Supreme Court cases to be interesting. Even though you can't, of course, see them, but you can certainly hear the back and forth between the Supreme Court justices and the lawyers representing their particular sides. There's an interesting, I would say, decision that gets made, which sometimes I've wondered whether or not it even gets made. But I find it funny sometimes where I'll be listening to some of these cases and some of these dialogues back and forth, and again, typically about a 5 or 6 minute clip. And I wonder whether or not the law firm representing either a group, a company, an individual, or whoever it may be, whether or not they make a decision on which lawyer to go with, because some of the lawyers that have been chosen for these particular cases to present in front of the Supreme Court have some of the worst verbal idiosyncrasies and habits that you could possibly imagine. Some of them speak very, very fast. Some of them can hardly speak the English language. Some of them, again, have a very high-pitched voice. Some of them don't. But it's just, again, there have been some cases in the past where I just laugh and I say, of all of the people in your law firm, this is the one that you decided to go with, the person who's the hardest to listen to. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just kind of a funny thing. But again, you can't see any of these people, but of course you can hear them. And you can hear the questions that get brought up, and in a lot of these cases, there's a lot of very serious history lessons that get brought up too, which is why I find it remarkably educational. Again, I fully understand not everybody's going to enjoy hearing these pieces of audio. Some of it might seem boring to some, but it's just something that I've always found to be interesting because I like the legalese, I like the back and forth, and I like hypothetical situations that get brought up, and then, of course, you can sort of corner a lawyer with a certain line of questioning and a number of other things. So in the last war video, I played a clip of Justice Alito during this case, and he was basically saying, okay, history's pretty clear when it comes to elections, and certainly when it comes to federally recognized days. We have this day, we have that day, we have Independence Day, we have President's Day, we have all these days, but they're just a day. It's not the day plus 1, or the day plus 2, or the day plus 3. That's not how it works, which means if you have election day, and it is a day, then there's something to be said about making it, again, a national holiday, in the sense that people would have time off of work so that they could vote, and that everybody, again, would have the day off so that they could vote, but that everybody votes that day. And that really is, again, the crux of the entire argument, which, again, you're going to hear audio of in just a few minutes. But there's an aspect, of course, of which you're not going to hear, which is sort of the hidden agenda that's actually taking place here. And not just the agenda, but will ultimately be the larger exposure of all of this, hopefully for the public to finally understand, is the cyber warfare that was taking place regarding the 2020 election. that during that election and even probably previous elections, but certainly 2020, and then, of course, all of the documentation and all of the presentations that happened after the fact, certainly Mike Lindell and everybody else and all of the tech bros that he had around him, it proved that votes were going overseas electronically. And then they were being changed, and then they were being sent back to the United States. And wouldn't you know that one of the countries that was receiving American votes, and people, I should say, or certainly deep state actors within foreign countries were receiving and manipulating these votes on the other end and certainly the other side of the world. But one of those countries was Iran. Again, Iran wasn't the only foreign country to be receiving American votes from the 2020 presidential election. You could probably say the same about Ukraine. Certainly Germany and Italy were proven to be the case. And it's not that, again, it was a prime minister or even that it was a singular individual who was the head of said country who was giving the okay for that to be the case. That probably wasn't. I mean, it's possible that they knew and that they, gave the go-ahead. I'm not saying that wouldn't be the case. I'm just saying that you probably had deep state actors within those countries working with individuals from our country to make sure that votes would be manipulated electronically. Now, as we know, the case that sits in front of the Supreme Court right now, Watson versus the Republican National Committee, it doesn't have anything to do with cybersecurity. It simply has to do with a process and a timeline. And again, during this process and timeline, as one might expect, is exactly where the fraud exists. Mail-in ballots, drop-off ballots, all of that stuff, and then, of course, counting ballots days after the fact. Now, as it turns out, there's 29 states that have mail ballots that allow for a grace period. Again, 29 states out of 50, that's not good. And if a person is, again, openly saying something like, well, they must be all left-wing states, that's certainly not the case either. These are massive states. Of course, they're all important. But the ones that, I should say, have these grace periods are the ones that always seemingly find their way into the news, certainly before, during, and after an election. And they have massive implications, as one might expect, for governor positions within these states, along with other, again, Secretary of State, Attorney General, the list is endless, right down to local elections. So it's, again, basically most of the South. It's all the way around. Kentucky and Tennessee are the only ones really around the Mason-Dixon line that don't have these grace periods. South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, they don't have them either. Neither does Louisiana. Wisconsin and Minnesota don't, but basically, again, most of the other ones do. New Mexico doesn't, Arizona doesn't, Utah, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, they don't have these grace periods, but almost all of the other states do. So again, it's a huge problem, but it's something that has to be squashed here because this is where a great deal of the fraud is taking place. If you have ICE agents, again, hopefully this is certainly, at least it's panning out like it's going to look this way. But if you have ICE agents on election day at polling stations, you're less likely to have illegals voting. If you have a Supreme Court ruling that is allegedly going to come down here in June regarding this particular case and the audio you're going to hear, if it comes down in June and it again says that the votes have to be counted on election day, not the days after, but all of the votes have to be in on election day. And by in, which again, you're going to hear very specifically, is, what does the word in mean? As opposed to who has the actual ballot and who's in possession of it. So again, that's why I like the nuance of all of this, because it is very specific, because it has to be. And as one might expect, it's very typical in cases like this where the same players come out of the woodwork who complain. And again, the only complaining taking place, typically speaking, are the individuals who enjoy mail-in ballots and enjoy, again, people voting by any means necessary and making it easier, quote unquote, for people to vote. Because remember, it's impossible for people to vote and black people can't vote, quote unquote, and they don't know how to get a driver's license. And I mean, it's all of the soft bigotry of the left that comes out where they say all of this stuff. And then they again try to gaslight the American public into believing that they're disenfranchising their fellow Americans from being able to actually vote. Voting is one of the easiest things that you can do. If I was to nitpick one thing about voting, there's a couple of things. Like you're not allowed to wear a political shirt or a political hat when you're voting. Those kinds of rules suck. And that's remarkably stupid. And frankly, in my opinion, it's a violation of the First Amendment. But the aspect of it that I don't like is that I shouldn't have to be forced to vote in one particular area. I'll give you a quick example. In the town where I live, based on my address, they ask that I vote at the local elementary school. I don't like voting there. And it's basically just for one reason. I don't like the old assholes that show up and vote there because I know some of them and they're assholes. And I just don't like running into them. I like to vote in peace and away from people who I either know or, don't care about or whatever. But I also have the ability, of course, when I early vote, which I do early vote, is that I'll vote in the county tax office and the county, whatever it is, the county level voter precinct, which is out of town, but it's worth it for me to drive out of town to go vote in another location. So again, if I basically, and I think it should work like this with anybody. Anybody should be capable of voting anywhere that they want in the general county in which they live. That way, again, if a person, again, doesn't want to vote in a particular area, then they don't have to. It's not that they're voting illegally. It's that because it's already in a database, it would already show that I had already voted. That way, if I vote in one particular area, but this other area, which is closer to my residence, is the place where I'm typically, expected to vote, I guess, then they would already know that I had already voted, which means if I tried to vote twice or someone tried to vote for me illegally, then they wouldn't be able to get away with it because, of course, the electronic apparatus would tell them that I had already voted on election day, on the actual day itself. I think that that's something that needs to be changed, but of course, that's a state level thing probably and whatever else. Anyway, let me get into the audio here now. And again, you're going to hear a lot of this back and forth, and it really is fascinating, at least in my opinion. I'm going to play this first one. This is from Clarence Thomas, and these are all clips from Forbes Breaking News on YouTube. And it's titled, Clarence Thomas Grills RNC Attorney on Legality of Early Voting in Mail-in Ballot Case. So the responding attorney for the Republican National Committee is a Paul D. Clement. And yeah, here's this first exchange, and I'll play exchanges from most of the justices, or at least I would say 3 of them, if not 4 or 5. But here's this first one again between Clarence Thomas and the RNC attorney in 3, 2, 1.
Mr. Clement?
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, all agree that elections for federal office have to end on the day of the election specified by Congress. And all agree that you can't have an election unless you receive ballots, and there must be some deadline for ballot receipt. Nonetheless, Mississippi insists that ballots can trickle in days or even weeks after Election Day. That position is wrong as a matter of text, precedent, history, and common sense. Mississippi all but concedes that the original public meaning of election included both offering to vote and the receipt of that vote or ballot by election officials. And of course, the key distinction between voting and an election is that an election involves the combined action of voters and election officials, as this court underscored in its decision against Foster against Love. And of course, Mississippi insists that at the time these statutes were passed, ballot receipt and the casting of the ballot were so inextricably intertwined, no one would have thought of one without the other. That seems to me to be a damning admission, but it also ignores the advent of field and proxy voting in the Civil War and the enormous efforts that states went to ensure that all of the ballots, whether by proxy or by field vote, were received by Election Day. In the state's view, all of those Herculean efforts were for naught or were entirely gratuitous. Now, the state's position actually works even worse as a matter of common sense. If somebody in Gulfport the day after the election asks, is the election over? The common sense answer is no, it's not. The ballots are still coming in. And if somebody asks who won, the truthful answer is, we don't know yet. The ballots are still coming in, and they may trickle in for weeks or months. And in fact, they may trickle in for weeks or months with or without a postmark in differing ways in differing states. That reality gives the lie to the idea that we have a uniform national election day. I welcome the court's questions.
How would you define the day of election?
I would say that the day of the election is the day, it's the last day in which all the ballots are cast and they are received into official custody.
So how would you treat early voting as compared to late reception of votes?
So I would say, I think the best place to look for a treatment of early voting is the Kreisling decision by Judge Kleinfeld in the Ninth Circuit. Because after Foster against Love, there was a suggestion in Foster against Love that maybe early voting is a problem. He rejected that claim based on two things. One is the distinct history of early voting, and the second is the idea that was explicit in this court's decision in Foster against Love that Election Day is the date of consummation. So I would say under our theory, early voting is permissible, largely because it has a different history and because of this idea that the Election Day is the date where the election is consummated.
Would you spend a few more minutes on, or at least a little bit more time on the voting during the Civil War? There was some suggestion that that's an example of late reception of votes. And I think in your intro, and was my thinking, that it was not, that proxy voting was a way to make sure that the vote occurred on Election Day as opposed to afterwards.
Well, not surprisingly, Justice Thomas, you were exactly right. So proxy voting is the thing that happened in the Civil War that is most analogous to absentee voting. And the thing that is most striking is I think 5 states had proxy voting. Every one of those 5 states required the votes, the ballots, to be received by election officials back home by Election Day. Now, that's an incredibly inconvenient thing that was done in the Civil War to ensure the ballots were received by Election Day. And under the state's view, they didn't need to do that. Now, it's really no different in the context of field voting because there were like maybe a dozen states, if you're not going to count the Confederate states, there are about a dozen states that did field voting. Again, every one of those ensured that the ballots were received into official custody by Election Day. And of course, most of the states went to enormous efforts to replicate the machinery of the ballot box and everything else in the field. And some variation in that. But the one thing that didn't vary at all was the ballots had to be received into official custody by Election Day. And just one last thought on this Civil War practice. My friend's only real answer to the idea that at 1845, there was an understanding that everybody would have had that, of course, the election involves both the offer to vote and receiving the vote, the ballot, into official custody. His only answer to that is, well, the issue hadn't ripened, that nobody had even thought that you could divide the two. But the issue ripened in the Civil War. And the issue ripened in such a way that every state required the ballot to be received into official custody by Election Day. And then that certainly informs what Congress is thinking in 1872 when they extend the presidential Election Day deadline to the congressional race.
Just a couple of thoughts here before I play the next clip. And you'll hear Justice Gorsuch in this next one basically approach this very directly. And he says, okay, so we have Election Day, and then you have, of course, mail-in ballots and absentee ballots and military ballots and all of that stuff, and ballots that come overseas from military individuals and what have you. So what constitutes actually possessing the ballot? Is it a person who is holding on to the ballot who is in the United States like a postal service worker, or is it the person actually counting the ballot on the day of election day. And of course, therein lies another argument, which is, are the ballots themselves supposed to be in the hands of the individuals counting the ballots when those ballots, again, have been filled out by somebody overseas? So again, theoretically, they would be early voting in order to get their ballots in on time in the United States to be counted in the United States. Again, this is why this is such a big deal, because you can see any chain of custody possessing fraud and just having the ability for fraud to exist within any transfer of a vote from the hands of one person to another. So again, just a couple of thoughts that I wrote down is that even though I've engaged in early voting before, and a lot of Americans have, I'm not a fan of it in the slightest. I don't think that it should exist. Again, you hear a lot of people manipulate early voting, and they'll claim that they have early voting polls. And well, based on early voting, it indicates that this person is taking a strong lead because we've done exit polling on early voting. I mean, it's outrageous. The more lines of communication that you limit, then the less manipulation you have. And I think that's an important point, because again, more people are likely to listen to how other people are voting. It's not that they can vote harder or, make their vote count more than anybody else's. It just gives the way to more fraud to exist. So if you cut those lines of communication, you're cutting the lines of manipulation and social engineering and psychological, again, deception to some extent. So again, I think early voting needs to stop. But the way that you reduce the congestion of voting at voting polls is you just have more polls available. That's the part that I don't understand, why that has to be so difficult. There should be, again, multiple polling locations within a singular town, not just one or two or three. Why can't there be a dozen of them? And then they're all hooked in, of course, to the same database, which again is unfortunate because it can still offer itself up to fraud. But a person isn't told which voting location they have to go to vote. They can just go to whichever one they want. Again, maybe they want to go to one that's closer to their home of residence, and maybe they want to go to the one that's across town. But they shouldn't be limited, or even, again, within their own county, but they shouldn't be limited to a singular place on election day. The other aspect too is that unfortunately we were actually heading, and this is a rather long-standing theory, which is, again, in the grand scheme of things, was not going to be good by any stretch of the imagination. But we were actually heading toward a widely accepted, probably via very strong coercive measures, not only mail-in ballots, and the ubiquitous nature of all of that, and everybody basically being forced to use mail-in ballots, which of course would have ushered in a level of fraud that people can't possibly comprehend, but actual internet voting. That they would basically sell it to your average fat American. They would say, okay, look, things are so tough out there, and there's all this disease and COVID and blah, blah, blah. You can't leave your house, and voting should be very easy. And in today's technical age, it's remarkably safe. Trust us, we're government. So you can just pull out your cell phone and then vote down the ballot as a registered or non-registered voter, illegal alien, whatever. And then before you know it, not only is everybody voting and everybody has the ability to vote, but you have the ability to vote from any location, no matter where you are, because you can do it from your cell phone. So what you're seeing is, and what we saw in the past was basically this. You saw a broadening and a stretching of what was deemed to be rather common sense federal law. Election day voting, no early voting, vote on election day, that's it. And then over the course of whatever it was, the last 15 plus years, you started to see different forms of voting and a manipulation of that very original law. Early voting, multiple days, weeks of early voting, Yes, you can still vote on election day, but now instead of voting in person, you can vote via mail. You can vote and drop it off at a drop box. Don't worry, we'll count it, we promise. Then voting machines and all of that. Getting away from the days of, again, taking the little metal pen and punching the hole through the vote. I mean, I voted that way in Florida lots of times. Primaries, general elections, you name it. But even so, it was just broadening itself, and now it's not. Now there's a full stop and a full reversal, and everything is shortening itself back up again to the point where we have to get back to singular day voting, paper ballot, watermark ballots. It's only your ballot. Not that the ballot has your name on it before you actually cast your vote, but at the very least, that there's a record of you actually doing it on a certified ballot. Something along those lines. So here's the next audio clip I want to play, and this is Neil Gorsuch. Again, he's also asking the Mississippi State Solicitor General Scott G. Stewart about a hypothetical situation involving mail-in ballots. And again, he I believe raises the question having to do with what constitutes in possession of a ballot, or in possession of a filled-in ballot that, again, was an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot. Who is it that has to possess that in order, again, for it to be counted appropriately on Election Day? So give him a listen in 3, 2, 1.
Well, I want to ask you about the recall problem. And before I get to that, throughout your brief, you say that that the federal statute does require voters to submit their ballots to election officials on Election Day, must be cast by Election Day, and that the Election Day is the day to conclude and consummate the election through a final selection. You agree with all those statements in your brief?
Yes.
Okay. But at the same time, you say, actually, it doesn't have to be submitted to an election official. It just has to be submitted to a common carrier. And there's a contradiction there that I just want you to first address, and then I'll give you my hypothetical.
Very good, Your Honor. I think when you put something in the mail, you're not, I think...
That's not an election official. FedEx isn't an election official.
Right, but the recipient certainly is the person who you're submitting it in the mail to. I mean, that is the recipient.
Of course.
And, right, Your Honor. And I think...
You submit it to FedEx and they deliver it to the election official. But you say it has to be submitted to an election official throughout your brief, but then you say a common carrier is okay. And those two things don't add up.
Well, I think the difference is, say, sending it to your brother versus sending it to the registrar.
Well, we already dealt with that. The brother turns out to be okay, as long as the state says so.
I think that's okay on their view, Your Honor. I'm
okay.
a little more guarded.
I think you already answered that one. So here's the hypo. Let's say you have a state where a large portion of the electorate mails in their ballots on or close to Election Day. Not far-fetched. Many states are like that. Then, the day after the election, a story breaks that one of the lead candidates engaged in an inappropriate sexual escapade, or perhaps is concluding with a foreign power. Again, not far-fetched, I think. And the competing candidate immediately goes on the airwaves and urges voters to recall their ballots and to tell the common carriers not to deliver them. And many common carriers will do that with anything that you send through them. FedEx, you just call them up and say, I want it back. In that hypothetical, did the election happen on Election Day? Oh, by the way, it swings the election.
So the election did happen on Election Day, Justice Gorsuch. As we've explained, our ballot does not allow using mail recall, anything like that. When somebody submits their ballot by mail...
Just first deal with my hypothetical, and then I'll deal with your statute.
Okay, the election happened on Election Day.
Even though it changes the outcome.
I mean, I think...
Yes, it has to be your answer, doesn't it?
I mean, yes, Your Honor. I want to be clear about the...
All right.
We are not agreeing that the outcome can be properly changed in that circumstance.
Well, hold on. It did in my hypothetical. You can't change my hypothetical, counsel.
And I'm just saying it's unlawful, Your Honor. I don't mean to disparage your hypothetical. I'm just saying that it's an unlawful circumstance because we don't allow that ballot.
Oh, in Mississippi. Okay, but that hypothetical could happen in another state, right?
I think if the state is not providing that on mailing there's a final choice made. I think that would be a problem with that law under the federal statutes.
Now you say your statute, you're different. You could bet my hypothetical could happen, but you say it can't happen in Mississippi because recall's not allowed. I couldn't find that anywhere in Mississippi law. In fact, what I did see was a statute that says that the Secretary of State can promulgate rules and regulations. That's 23-15-637-3. And then I went and looked at the regulations. And Rule 2.1 says that an absentee ballot is the final vote of a voter when the ballot is marked accepted. That doesn't preclude recall.
And
in fact, that allows recall.
I respectfully don't agree with that, Your Honor. I mean,
where does it say recall's not permitted? I couldn't find that anywhere in your statutes or the rule.
And I think by providing that ballots are final when cast under our statute.
No, it doesn't. It says they're final when marked accepted.
That's the regulation, Your Honor.
Yeah.
And
it's your regulation. And it allows recall.
It does. Respectfully, it does not allow recall, Your Honor. The
Show me where. Would you read to me the provision that precludes it?
It's subsection 3 of the statute that my friends have found.
I read you said subsection 3 that says the Secretary of State can make rules, and then I read you the rule
to ensure that the ballots are final when cast. The key thing is ballots are final when cast.
It says no votes promulgated by an absentee ballot that the absentee ballot person's absentee vote is final. You can make rules about when they're final. And what the rule says is it is final when marked accepted.
And it's speaking to a processing rule about what to do when somebody's ballot potentially doesn't arrive on time. They submit an affidavit ballot. But I would come back to the text of the statute, Your Honor. I mean, final when cast is what our law.
Couple of things. First of all, I've been listening to Neil Gorsuch a long time, dating back to his confirmation hearing, and I do like his approach. I really do. He's calm, he's collected, there's no doubt about that. And he has a sense of humor, and he always provides a very direct, hypothetical situation, and he's very good at it. And he does that consistently. And it's a good listen even for a layperson, so to speak, because again, he's basically providing a hypothetical situation that's common sense. What exactly constitutes an accepted ballot? Is it when the male person touches it? Is it when it touches the hands of the next male person, when the ballot is in transit? Is it the moment that the election, or not the election, but the actual ballot itself is finished, and the person voting actually finishes their last vote and then stamps it and licks the envelope and then seals it and says, well, now I voted, it's official, I voted, that's the end of it? Or is it when it's actually counted? Now, we know the answer to that question. It's when it's counted. Point being, it has to be counted. These votes have to be actually counted on Election Day. So, this is where it's going to get complicated. Because again, for individuals overseas, absentee ballots, military votes, things of that nature, that would imply that those individuals would be the only ones with the rights to vote early. But even those votes could be manipulated. But maybe not if they're on watermarked official ballots that are the same as the ones that we would use here when we would be voting on actual Election Day. And this next clip is Amy Coney Barrett, and she's asking Paul D. Clement, the RNC lawyer, again about Civil War era election laws. Give this a listen in 3, 2, 1.
Justice Barrett?
So I'm trying to figure out how to think about the history. And you said a moment ago that what we have is the original public meaning of Election Day at the time, and in the late 19th century, in 1917, et cetera, was ballot receipt. And you invoked the various state laws that required receipt by Election Day. But we don't have, to my knowledge, so this is what I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, a rich history of original public meaning in the way that we often think of it, of people saying or expressing views that, yes, this is what it means to elect. This is what Election Day means. Stripped down to its essence, it means the taking of the ballot into official custody. What we have is state practices. I think there are a lot of really good policy reasons to require, and we've talked about some of those this morning, lots of good policy reasons to require all the ballots to be in by Election Day. Do we have evidence either of people saying, like, this is what we understand Election Day to require, as opposed to treatises that are summarizing some of the cases? And is there any reason to think that these laws were adopted because of a concern about preemption by federal law, as opposed to just, this is a really good policy, this is how elections should run?
So we're in the realm of congressional actions under the Election Clause and the Electors Clause. So everything they're doing is preemptive. And that's particularly obvious in the context of trying to get a uniform national election day for the general election. So I think we're like in the absolute epicenter of intertribal here, because not only is it like sort of preemptive by its very nature, but it's Congress trying to create uniformity across state lines. So Congress was sort of appalled by what had happened with the staggered deadlines and disparate deadlines in the states. So I think the preemption part of that is kind of relatively straightforward. Now, on the history, this is where I just think the Civil War practice is so powerful, because my friend says, well, when they were first passed, like the difference between casting and receiving the ballot into official custody hadn't ripened. But the Civil War ripened it. And the one thing every state, including Rhode Island and Nevada, did is they said it has to be in some kind of official custody by Election Day.
And I agree with you, that's striking. But maybe I wasn't clear before. I agree with you that that's striking. But do we have any reason to think that they did that because they thought, well, it has to happen on Election Day or by Election Day, which is a deviation from what the text says, right? But do we have any reason to think that they did it because they thought they had to, as opposed to, this is really good policy, so we should do it this way?
No, I think to me, can I connect the dots precisely? No, but they did it because they thought that's what an election means. And that's what an election day means. They thought it would just be unthinkable. It would no longer be an election or an election day. It wouldn't be happening on election day if it could take place, if ballot receipt could take place some other time.
Isn't that true of early voting too? And I guess this goes back to Justice Kagan's question. I mean, it seems to me that if you look at the historical practice, what an election meant was showing up in person and casting your vote and being qualified as the voter on that same day. And then there were deviations for war, essentially. But why would absentee voting in a widespread way by civilians or early voting, why is that permissible? Because if we're just going to say that historically it needs to look like it always looked, how come those features fall out?
I would say they probably fall out because nobody thinks they're essential, which is to say, if a state wanted to have early voting, but no voting on election day, maybe that would be a hard case. But, those I think have been understood, and there's a different history for those, because if a state wants to say you can come in and you can mark your ballot and put it into official custody a week early, that doesn't sort of vitiate the whole idea of an election day. Whereas if you can still have ballots being received after Election Day, I think that vitiates the whole notion of Election Day. And if you're interested in Professor Morley or Justice Kavanaugh's tiebreakers, there's not the same concerns about fraud, about the losers not being able to accept the outcomes when it comes to early voting. But there's a distinct problem with voting with ballots that come in, and particularly if they're going to tip an election. And as Justice Gorsuch indicated, maybe it's happened, maybe it hasn't, but it will. And at that point, there's just no way the loser whoever it is going to accept that outcome, and the supporters aren't going to accept the outcome. And so that's something that I just don't think is implicated by early voting.
Coney Barrett, again, mentioned it right there, that there became this loosening of particular policy from state to state, again, based on quote-unquote conflict. And that as a result of that, you had different states basically creating their own rules. The fact of the matter is there has to be one rule for the entire country, regardless of state. I'm all for state laws and differing state laws. I mean, okay, I guess, that's fine and dandy. And again, I understand the constitutional nature of all of it. I mean, I get it. You basically have 5 separate governments. But federal law should, of course, continue to trump anything having to do with any local law whatsoever. Certainly, of course, when it comes to actual elections themselves. People shouldn't have different laws in different states based on how they can or cannot vote, when there should just be one election day, federal holiday. This is how everybody votes. But at the same time, that shouldn't be just limited to election day voting. It has to be the same with primary voting. It has to be the same with off-presidential election day voting, midterm elections, and, you name it. It just needs to be the same across the board. You shouldn't have differing policies, quote unquote, from state to state, at least not in my opinion. And of course, when you bring in the whole conflict aspect of it, that was part of the thing that was broadening all of the abilities and ways in which a person could vote. It started with war, and most recently 2020, with the whole COVID lie. That's when the mail-in ballots showed up. And I'm shocked that so many people participated. But then again, I'm not, because endless people, of course, fell for the COVID lie, but they also fell for everything that came with that Trojan horse, one of which was voter fraud and voting by ballot and drop box and all this other bullshit that, again, people just participated in because they thought that for some reason it was either more secure or they knew that it had to do with fraud and that this was their opportunity to steal an election. I'm going to play one more piece of audio here. Again, this is Gorsuch again, and he's going back to the argument of, again, mail-in voting and mail-in ballots and early voting and things of that nature. Again, he's responding to the RNC lawyer again, specifically having to do with mail-in votes and when they become a final decision by the actual voter. Give him a listen in 3, 2, 1.
On early voting, I just want to see if I've got it right. Both sides agree that there needs to be a final decision by the voter and receipt by election day. Correct?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think they agree with receipt by election day.
Receipt by somebody.
Okay, if you're going to,
I'm going to do that.
The reason I trip up on that,
I know, but just
okay. Sorry.
But this is. I'm just trying to make sure I understand. There needs to be some final decision by the voter and receipt by somebody by election day. On that, I think you two agree. I think the disagreement is receipt by whom. And for you, it's an election official. And for your friend on the other side, it could be my neighbor. Is that a fair summary of your views? Because it seems to me you both agree that the final decision needs to be made by election day, which both of you therefore would permit early voting.
So I don't disagree much, but what I would say is my friend's position is a little bit more nuanced than that, because he thinks that sort of selection and submission to the somebody is before election day is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient because Mississippi law cares very much about receipt by the registrar. And if the vote is submitted to the somebody before election day, but it's not received by the registrar until the 6th day, it's a nullity. So that's just the subtlety that I wanted to add.
No, I appreciate that because at least as I read Mississippi law, you're right that it isn't accepted until an election official marks it accepted. That's its own rule. But it seems to be running away from that here by saying, at least as I'm understanding it, I might be misunderstanding it, but at least as I understand it, because they're saying, no, once it goes into FedEx or to my neighbor or whomever, it's received effectively on election day.
See, I don't think they've quite gone that far because, they can try to quibble about the sort of receipt rule in the reg, but the statute itself absolutely requires receipt by the registrar within 5 days.
Yeah.
And then the statute itself goes on to say that if it's not received by the registrar within 5 days, even though it was submitted, even though it went to FedEx, it's a nullity and it must be destroyed. I mean, Mississippi takes its receipt deadline so seriously that if you miss their receipt deadline, your ballot is destroyed.
If we were to rule against you, is there anything that would limit states from allowing receipt by election officials up until the day of next Congress.
Oh, the slippery slope problem on the other side, I don't think there's anything that would stop that. And maybe the next state can figure out a way to have an election without even anybody receiving anything. I don't know. But that seems to me to be a large reason for why election day should mean election day and election should mean casting and receipt into official custody to stop that slippery slope.
On time, and how about means? Do you see any principled way we could draw a line on means and say, okay, common carriers are different than Bob?
See, I think it's tricky, especially because all of these statutes purport to be time regulations, not manner regulations. And the thing to keep in mind is that under Article 2, the congressional power is limited to time regulations. Manner is left to the states under Article 2's election clause or electors clause. So it's a little different than Article 1, where Congress, if it wanted to, could correct the means. And so that's why I think it's either all or nothing in terms of their position, and they have no basis for distinguishing the states that say, like Illinois, that say 14 days with or without a postmark.
By anybody.
By anybody.
Again, at the end of the day, it has to be one rule for everybody in our country, across the board. All of this stuff about, well, grandma can't get to the polling place, or it's difficult for them to do so, or whatever it is. Again, I think the Save America Act even has some of that written in. That when it comes to disability or the inability to actually move yourself from your place of residence, wherever that may be, to a polling location, that there are accommodations, of course, that can be made. But as we know, even in those accommodations, that's where the fraud is likely to exist. In the end, though, it's about cutting off the different means in which the fraud can exist. And right now, there are many, and there have been many, for a very long time, for far too long. 2020 was one of the last plays, of course, that ushered in a boatload of new methods in which voter fraud can exist, and it did, and that was just face value fraud. That wasn't even the cyberkinetic fraud that was taking place, let alone the intercontinental fraud that was going on with our own elections. And again, that's one of, I don't want to say it's one of the hidden elements of all of this, because I think it's rather public knowledge at this point, but individuals, again, in Iran, representing the Democrat Party, certainly favoring them at the very least, were again moving votes in Joe Biden's direction, and of course, even on local ballots, moving votes within those individuals to control those areas, whether they be attorney generals or other individuals, judges, you name it, that those lines of communication ultimately have to stop and be shut down. And that's one of the hidden elements with the Iran play that is not being discussed, which is a big play here. It's no different than the Ukrainian element. The same thing was happening in Ukraine. But again, by taking out these deep state areas where these people, again, were able to operate for a great deal of money, I mean, you're not going to try to steal an election for free. Somebody's going to pay you, and they're going to pay you handsomely. But if you can cut down those lines of communication, and you can do it from multiple angles, both, again, on the enemy playground in a foreign country, but also in our own country with our own law, then that's how we certainly win, or at the very least, I would say, start to change the tide here and shift the tide, which is a good thing. So there's a number of different things happening right now, but again, I think that the Save America Act is going to pass eventually. I think that that's going to lead to more ICE agents showing up at polling places, which is a good thing. They've already shown up at airports, and they've already had copious amounts of success. I think that's pretty clear. Individuals have been detained. Individuals have been arrested. It's a deterrence method. People are not showing up trying to escape with suitcases full of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of cash. And it's providing, again, more security, better security than what the TSA was doing, if I was to go that far. Let me give you a quick example. This was a text that was sent by a friend of mine and a listener of the show. They said the following, quote, "I'm glad ICE agents are in the airports. I've noticed airport security has gotten far too abusive with American citizens. I'm relieved there's some federal oversight. I hope this is the beginning of TSA being dismantled. During COVID, quote unquote, they had airline employees pose as passengers and harass anyone on the plane who took their mask off. You could tell they knew the flight attendants. The way they whispered to one another, it was obvious they were working together. Plus, other passengers, it says, offered to change seats with them when they got offered by my mask refusal, and they declined the offers. If someone is so afraid sitting next to me is going to make them ill, why would they jump at the chance to move away from me? Unquote. Again, they're right, and the COVID scheme and the COVID lie really ushered in a level of deviancy among these individuals who work within these agencies that is a level of deviancy that we've never seen before. Just the blind willingness to go along to get along and to just do what you're told based on your paycheck and orders that you receive, or this is our mandate, this is our policy, and then they just do it blindly. It makes it rather easy to see, I think, how voting policy could easily be shifted in a very negative direction. And like the justices were saying earlier, and certainly the RNC lawyers, it creates a very serious, dangerous, slippery slope where you basically don't get your rights back. They just slowly get taken away. And we know that that's happened, of course, over the course of our lifetimes, regardless of what generation you live in. But there has to be a plugging of the dam at some point, and then a complete reversal. So with that said, let me read a couple of online posts here from a few different boards. First of all, this is from X, and this was Brian Cates' account from a couple of days ago. And he said the following. He said, quote, "Many people can't see yet that President Donald J. Trump has literally been kicking the living shit out of the exact same group of people for the past 14 months, the same people running Iran from the shadows run by the Democratic Party. It says they are one and the same. I call these people the transitional crime syndicate of oligarch family big club pirates. They are the few people who've been controlling everything from the shadows using various front groups and proxy regimes that they control. When it's called a big club, quote unquote, you have to understand that's a sarcastic term. The big club of oligarch family pirates is less than 0.0001 of the world's population. One by one, over the past 14 months, Trump has exposed and degraded their control of their front groups and their proxy regimes. Number one, he took out their fake executive branch agencies, especially that fake AF Treasury Department, quote unquote. He cut off their access to around 400 to 700 billion they were looting yearly straight out of the Treasury Department, of course, USAID. Number two, he took control of the U.S. military away from them and actually began putting it to work defending the United States and its interests. Number three, he took control of world trade and U.S. industry away from them and instituting tariffs and bringing U.S. national security industries back from where the big club pirates had deliberately offshored it. Number four, he shut down their massive U.S. drug human trafficking profits. Number five, he diffused and exported their cartel gang insurance policy. Number six, he's exposing the hundreds of billions that have been stolen domestically via welfare, social services fraud, and is moving to shut it down. Number seven, the big club of oligarch family pirate front groups, the U.S. Congress, the federal courts, the Democrats and Republican parties, have ended up repeatedly exposing and weakening themselves as they tried to stop Trump. Number eight, so too have the numerous proxy regimes the big club pirates control ended up exposing and weakening themselves in their frantic attempts to stop Trump from destroying their precious and long-shielded geopolitical world order. NATO, EU, Israel, Iran, Canada, Australia, Pakistan, Ukraine, etc. Number nine, he is literally and openly shoving aside their proxy organizations for global control and replacing them as they watch with mounting horror. It says, goodbye United Nations, hello Board of Peace, goodbye NATO, hello Shield of the Americas. Number 10, he's now gutting their energy insurance choke point control racket and deboning it like a fish, which will cause trillions more in international wealth to suddenly shift away from the big club shadow pirates and towards those who are building a new global age without City of London control. But of course, you don't see or know any of this if you follow the stars or you get your view of Trump's new term from podcasters who think they're smarter and better informed than he is. You probably think Trump's new team has been a big disaster, a DA wasted opportunity thus far. Don't know what that means, but I get what he's saying. And if you're listening to some currently famous, popular, or influential podcast stars, well, it doesn't matter. Nothing can stop what is happening, unquote. He's right. I mean, a great deal of great things are happening. There is no doubt. And again, you have to slow things down, certainly from the direction that they were moving in, and you have to pump the brakes, and then you have to stop. And then, of course, you have to course correct, and then there has to be a complete reversal. And we're living through that to a great extent, which, again, is a fascinating thing to see. It doesn't mean that there's still not concern, certainly at the local level. But this is one of the elements of the Great Awakening, which is undeniable, is that more people are paying attention to the fraud that's happening at the local level, which they should be paying attention to. Here's a quick little thing, a little side note here before I get into, again, more local issues, and there is one specifically, of course, having to do with property taxes and then property taxes nationwide. But this just has to do with Adam Schiff, who, again, is one of these deep state players, and he, of course, is going to be going to jail, and he'll have to, if not be executed for crimes against humanity, and, of course, trying to overthrow an election and engage in an open coup, more specifically. This is from GreatAwakening.win, and I think this is pulled originally from X. But it says a Democrat whistleblower just made a statement to the FBI that could send Adam Schiff to prison. A whistleblower has told the FBI agents that Adam Schiff personally authorized and directed his team to leak classified intelligence to damage Donald Trump during the Russia investigation. Let's be precise about what this means and why it matters, and that this was said to the FBI specifically. It says constitutional law Professor Jonathan Turley laid it out clearly. The chairman of the House Intelligence Committee does not have declassification authority over this type of material. These documents are made available to Congress under tightly controlled rules. Schiff, Turley said, was viewed as one of the most political chairs of that committee in its history. Now here's the critical legal point. This isn't an anonymous tip to a reporter. This is a statement made directly to FBI agents. Turley noted that whoever made this statement was fully aware that lying to federal agents is not just a crime, it's a crime that was repeatedly prosecuted by Mueller, Obama, and Biden's own DOJ. Making a false statement to the FBI puts you personally at risk, which means, as Turley put it simply, someone is lying here and someone is a felon. If the allegation is true, what are we looking at? Each leaked document is a separate criminal violation. Count stacking, the same method used against Trump associates during Russiagate, could put Schiff at 10 years or more. And unlike a Mar-a-Lago case where Trump was accused of negligence, this would be something far more damning. A premeditated criminal act to leak classified information to damage a political opponent. See, I would take it a step further and say it's not just to damage a political opponent, is to engage in a coup against a sitting president. It says this is the man who stood in front of cameras for 3 years telling America he had seen evidence of Trump-Russia collusion with his own eyes, evidence that never materialized, evidence that Mueller never found. Watch this space, unquote. There most certainly has to be accountability. You can't go on national television consistently and say that you have evidence against a president of the United States and that there was cheating involved and so-called collusion when in fact there wasn't. I mean, again, the reason that Donald Trump can get away with saying it regarding them and the whole Russia lie and all of that is because he's the one with all the evidence, and they know that. Again, he's the head of the executive branch. Think of the information that he has at his disposal if he just asks for it. It's pretty astounding, I think. A couple other things here. Apparently, you have a Rothschild bank in Paris that was raided last Friday in connection with the Epstein investigation, allegedly. That's, I think, rather interesting. We can take a guess as to what documentation they might have. Certainly money exchange, which would be rather obvious, I would assume. And then as I am recording this, you have a Senate hearing taking place. I believe it's the Judicial Committee, if I'm not mistaken, Judiciary Committee. Anyway, they are looking into Operation Arctic Frost, which was the FBI code name for the federal probe launched in April of 2022, where basically, again, Donald Trump was saying that the election was stolen. And then, of course, the bad guys were saying, well, he's only bringing this up because he was the one who was trying to steal it. It's the old accuse your enemy of the thing that you yourself are doing. That, of course, involved Jack Smith and everything else, but endless witnesses are now coming out openly saying that Jack Smith is a fraud, that he was violating policy, breaking law. He was looking where he didn't have the right to look. He was doing things that he shouldn't have been doing because, of course, when you're looking for something that doesn't exist, you have to break the law. But when you're looking for something that's out in the open, there isn't a single law that needs to be broken in order to find it because it's out in the open. Jack Smith and the people that he worked with, again, engaged in, I wouldn't necessarily say a coup, but unlawfully trying to imprison a former president. And if Jack Smith doesn't know that the Insurrection Act was signed before Biden took office, which that's my theory, and I'm not the only one who shares that, then that would mean, again, that Jack Smith was probably under the surveillance of the military, which means the military has all of the information that Jack Smith was, again, trying to gather, or at the very least, all of the things that he was attempting to do and actually doing himself, along with, again, the people that he was associating with, which means he's got to go down, and so do all of his secretaries and all the little people running errands for him and everything else. Because, again, if any of them even had an inkling that a law was being broken, well, you got to report that to somebody, and that's a big problem. Or at the very least, you resign, and then you turn the tables on them, and you become a whistleblower, and then, again, you provide your testimony. I think that's happening, and I think that's happening a lot, even behind the scenes. Most people are never going to see the actual individuals, again, that turned over evidence that implicated these individuals in what they were doing. So, yeah. We got to see some people go to jail. That has to happen eventually. Okay, let me read this very quickly. Again, this has to do with property taxes and a lot of the lies that get told when it comes to property taxes, specifically schools. It basically echoes what I've brought up on the show, in my own opinion, before. But this is a well done post. This is Just Gen RX at JustGenRX over on X from March 23rd, and they said the following: Dear my fellow Ohio residents/voters, public schools are panicking about our property taxes being abolished, and some of the superintendents are claiming their districts will be out of money by 2027. This is not true. Ohio public schools have a rainy day account which currently has $10.5 billion in it. Administrators and teachers are being paid more each year. Some districts, like Mentor Public Schools, pay their teachers up to $80,000 a year, and Ohio public school students are getting dumber each year. Ohio public schools are currently in the claws of the teachers' unions and school board association. They push leftist Marxist indoctrination in schools by using SEL, social emotional learning curriculum, because the students are definitely not learning, and they're still pushing DEI and gender ideology. Again, basically everything I've brought up on the show. Glad that this person agrees. It says our students' proficiency scores are at all-time lows because of this. They do not care about parental rights in education either. They'd rather keep porn in K12 too. No matter how many taxpayers come to the school board meetings, the school board does what the teachers union and school board association wants, completely ignoring the concerned taxpayers/parents. I spent 2 years trying to get the school board to listen to our concerns regarding everything I listed above, to no avail. So when they're panicking, saying that they can't afford to abolish your property taxes, when some districts get up to 80% of your taxes, they lie. All of that money goes into numerous bank accounts that are high interest yielding. And again, That rainy day fund for Ohio schools sits at $10.5 billion, and that's collecting interest every month it sits there. Vote those property taxes away in May, unquote. Now, what she's referring to, first of all, is that Mentor Public Schools is going to have a property tax levy, a $4.9 million property tax levy on the May ballot. The statewide tax proposal is still in the signature gathering phase, but it's got more than enough momentum, and it'll probably make its way to the November ballot. That's what people are hoping. And in typical fashion, like I've brought up on the show before, that means that these school districts are rushing to put levies on their ballots both for May and potentially for November as well, or even shortly after November, potentially the following May of 2027. And just to quickly review in the state of Ohio now, because it's law, is that if you attempt to have a school property tax levy and it fails, you can't propose another property tax levy for a school ever again, which means an income tax levy is the only other option, basically, and that's happening with regularity here in Ohio. So you have Fairfield City Schools is proposing a 1.25% earned income tax levy. Mount Healthy, Franklin City, and New Richmond income or property tax proposals. Urbana City Schools, 1% income tax, earned income tax. Paynesville City and Wickliffe, if I'm saying that right, city income tax proposals in Lake County. Kettering City Schools, a $5.93 million bond issue for construction and renovations, and it goes on and on and on. I think in Florida, the Florida House just passed a no property tax initiative, which is good. That's a good thing. But again, if anybody believes that abolishing property tax is going to sink a public school, it won't. It's going to cause the public school to tighten its books, to stop engaging in fraud and money wasting. But again, they don't even want to do that, which is why they're running back to the ballots in an effort to again throw levies on the ballot and tax everybody again. The other thing too is that rent costs would decrease. If there's no more property taxes and you own rental property, well, you can save a little bit of money. And you can make sure that more people are going to live in your rental property as opposed to, again, particular locations being vacant, because you can lower the price because you don't, of course, have the overhead of having to pay property taxes. This is great for all businesses. But, oh God, you're not going to have a fire truck. And, oh God, you're not going to have another cop car. And, oh God, you're not going to have this and have that. Too bad. Too bad. Find the money elsewhere. Have a bake sale. Or just stop engaging in property fraud and tax fraud, which is why we're in this position in the first place. It's been a long-standing, well-known fact that when the American people have more of their own money that isn't being stolen by government, and they're aware of this, of course, and they receive that money back, they tend to do rather good things with it. They save it, they get out of debt, they might even move to a better location. They might make renovations, which of course, to any living area, always increases property value and of course stimulates the economy because you pay individuals to renovate particular properties. You make corrections, you do things that need doing. That's a good thing. But government is saying, no, we're in control. You're fine because we say so, and we need property taxes because if we don't have them, we're all screwed. No, only the corrupt institutions will get screwed. If you increase sales tax, so what? So what? People pay a little bit more to buy a particular thing. People are already trying to not buy things, by and large, these days. They're not making massive, huge purchases. At least they're trying to avoid it, and rightfully so. But people are trying to keep more of their own money. And like I've said in the past, if property taxes are abolished and a person runs to a ballot the next time around and votes to be taxed for their local school district, you're a complete retard. There's zero way around that. You're an absolute moron. You were given a taste of freedom, and then you threw the shackles right back on your wrists. That's a special kind of retarded right there. Speaking of retarded, Vivek Ramaswamy continues to be exposed in the state of Ohio with past comments that he's made, that he'll speak in front of AIPAC saying one particular thing, that we should put our enemies' heads on stakes and we should fight and defend Israel and blah, blah, blah. And then he speaks to a Christian group and he doesn't have the same vigor. He doesn't have the same energy. I'll mention this in conclusion. Again, I don't know anything about this necessarily, but it was popping up online. Just wanted to make a quick mention of it. Apparently there was a fire in Port Arthur, Texas, regarding the Valero oil refinery there. A lot of people online are saying that it was an Israeli false flag and an Israeli attack, because back on March 17th, there was a lot of chatter online coming from Israel about that specific Port Arthur, Texas oil refinery, begging the question, why is it that people in Israel would be talking about a Texas oil refinery that just so happened to be attacked approximately 1 week later, or at the very least suffer explosions and damage and fire and the whole thing 1 week later? Rather interesting. Again, things like that do move the market a little bit. It does fluctuate price, but hopefully not too badly and not too much. But yeah, I find it fascinating because remember all of the grain silos and refineries and food plants that were being attacked in the United States? Certainly during the runoff to the election there, or run up to the election in 2024, while Biden was still in office. I find it interesting that we still haven't gotten to the public bottom, so to speak, of who is behind all of that. We may never get to the bottom of it, but we can certainly speculate. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening, and I will catch you on Friday. Peace. Thank you for listening to American Education FM. Make sure and check out AmericanEducationFM.com for more information. Take care and God bless.